Business ethics. I thought this was going to be a pretty short block, you know, and I thought, again, there's no such thing as business ethics, you know, and that's going to be an empty shelf in the library. And to be honest, you know, it's yes and no. But I think, having looked at this, there is quite interesting stuff out there in terms of business ethics. Not a huge amount, but I would say that it's gathering ground. There are increasing developments, and again, it's not just corporations trying to manipulate the environment, but real heavy-duty scholarship saying, you know, we've got to move corporations to a different spot. And obviously, some people still see corporate responsibility as completely useless, but there is increasing scholarship within business ethics in terms of corporate governance. I think that's something that a lot of people see as needed after all the various meltdowns and, you know, the stuff that's going on in corporate boardrooms. So increasing pressure in terms of governance, increasing pressure to change organizational values. I think there's quite a significant amount of work on that. And quite interesting, I think, which feeds back again into constructivism, a lot of emphasis on the importance of reputation, corporate reputation, which is somewhat amorphous, but I think people in the business world anyway are increasingly seeing reputation as valuable, that a bad reputation can do damage, and a good reputation can do good things. So how do we get to that reputation? So that again leads us through the corporate ethics literature, even though it may be manipulated, even though the end result, you know, might be not what we want, but this emphasis on reputation is really gathering ground and quite important. The other thing to mention is stakeholder theory, which is something that we're familiar with elsewhere. But again, if you go back in the corporate ethics literature more than 15, 20 years ago, there was very little concern for stakeholders. It was all shareholders, it's all profit, and so on. And it may still well be for many corporations. But increasingly we're seeing that corporations have to act in the interests of various stakeholders, including, you know, the workforce, including local communities, and so on. And it may take a lot to get that fully entrenched in all corporations, but that is certainly something which is also there. So I don't have them listed, but I do here. But I have kind of developed what seems to be some common points of agreement in terms of an evolving global ethical standard. And they are there. They do exist. Whether they're operationalized fully is obviously a different debate, but the ideas are developing around a set of common standards for ethical behavior of corporations. The other thing which is developed is what's called strategic philanthropy, that again, corporations are saying, well, you know, in the old days we might just write a check. Now we want to write a check with some involvement. We want to think strategically about where this money is going. And so that's this linkage of, you know, we can do good and still make a profit. For so long people said, well, if you're corporate responsible, you can't make money. And increasingly the debate or the agreement is, you know, no, that's not true. You can pursue profit and you can be responsible. And so this strategic philanthropy is the term that often brings that together in terms of strategic thinking for the business, but also thinking about, you know, how they can do good and better. And of course then increase their profits. What is corporate responsibility? You know, I thought I should have done this at the beginning, but basically, again, if you look at it, it's something which most people agree has been developing from the 70s. But it's hard to go back beyond that and see any mention of it. And most agreements is around the Sullivan principles. That's this primarily where it gets started, which is the series of principles for business in the anti-apartheid movement and movement against South Africa. So most people see that the Sullivan principles were the main instigator of thinking about corporate practice in particularly obviously in South Africa and the developing world, but generally. And obviously, as I like to point out, it seems like every disaster has added to that. So whether it's Exxon Valdez or Bhopal or Enron or whatever, but we do have, and you can actually see this, that as each disaster unfolds in the global environment, so the movement of corporate responsibility increases. So again, we see that correlation that the more bad things happen, the more we want to move forward. So really, 30, 40 years, but probably the last 10, I would make the case is when it's really come about. Some definitions, and this I'm just putting out because I think it ties in a little bit to the constructivist ideas, but economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic expectations placed on organizations by society at a given point in time. Okay, so expectations, okay? Voluntary statements committing organizations to specific beliefs and actions. So again, beliefs, expectations. A commitment to improve community well-being, okay, well-being. So very much, I see those are some of the core definitions, there's many more, but the idea is linked to society, linked to societal benefit, linked to changing our patterns of behavior, changing our thinking about the outcomes in terms of better corporate practice. As I say, not completely purist. Clearly, companies will allow themselves profit. They have to have profit. The other thing that I'm suspicious of, and again, it's a major criticism of corporate responsibility, is that perhaps this is just a technique to prevent bad publicity. That it's just a game that's being played, that the more you say these things, the more you can protect yourself, the more ads you can take out in the New York Times to say how brilliant you are and so on. That it really may potentially boil down to that, but that's the cynic inside of me in terms of reputation, and I think reputation is important. But again, I think, so what? If you're just protecting your reputation but still doing good things, isn't that okay? I don't know, we can talk about that. So the final section, and I'm doing well unless my clock has stopped, is, okay, so what are some of the findings? What are there global norms out there? Do we see them? Are things taking place? And this is primarily an empirical assessment of what exists. And without much digging, and I've been doing a lot of digging, but even if you don't do much digging, there's literally dozens of these global standards developing. We can see everywhere these global norms, agreements, set of practices, many, many out there, perhaps too many. And I think that's one of the criticisms that I might have, that there's just too many of these things, and nobody really knows, what do we do, what do we look at, who's in charge, and so on. And again, there's literally hundreds of multinationals involved in these practices that have signed up to these corporate norms, these global norms that are developing. Some examples, and some of these you'll know. I mean, the UN Global Compact, which I found out, interestingly, in an interview, was going to be called the Global Sullivan Principles, but the UN said, you can't really name it after a person, so we're going to call it the Global Compact. But clearly built from the Sullivan Principles, but at a global level, and that's perhaps the best known. But others, the Business Call to Action, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which has several hundred organizations within it. The International Labour Organization is doing very interesting work. It's one of the few organizations of the UN system that doesn't only have state members. So the ILO has corporate members and it has members from labor. And so they are really seeing themselves, or they sell themselves that, when you talk to them, as at the forefront, because of the nature of that organization, in bringing together government, business, and labor to bring about various declarations and policies, better work program, tripartite declarations, all sorts of other things. The OECD in Paris is in this, International Business Leaders Forum. There are many, there's as I say, dozens of these organizations, and quite significant. And again, if it's just helping us to think of these issues, helping to lay out a debate, helping to change a conversation, then they're there, and that's pretty good. We also have examples now of specific industry standards, CSRs. So, for example, the Kimberley process for diamonds, which isn't perfect, but in terms of trying to control the flow of diamonds and conflict diamonds and so on, and provide transparency is important. Another one is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is working in the oil, gas, and mining sectors. Again, not perfect, but trying to bring transparency. One of the key things that they do is provide full information, full disclosure as much as possible anyway, of how much money countries are making. So corporations will publicize that information so that local people will know, okay, well, where is that money going? Yeah. So all I'm saying is when you actually go and look at this and say, well, what substance is there? What is there out there? What are we seeing produced by all this hot air? There are many relatively strong, relatively influential organizations, either for global kinds of membership or for industry-specific membership, which you can debate, and maybe we'll debate, well, how important are they? But I always say they're better than nothing. They create an environment for conversation and discussion and dialogue. They set standards. They put corporations on notice that this is expected practice, or it should become expected practice. So, nothing happens overnight, but all of these institutions, I think, are great examples of what is possible. So I would make the case, starting to wrap up here, that there is quite significant empirical evidence here of some significant change in the environment, the global environment, in thinking, in terms of values and attitudes. And I'm not saying that corporations are necessarily doing this voluntarily. A lot of them are kicking and screaming into the boardrooms, but nevertheless, I would say there is some movement. So positive in that sense, but as always, you always tend to finish with some negatives. And there's some problems. When you look at who's involved in this, it still seems to be primarily rich Western multinationals. So it seems to be a luxury that big corporations can afford to play with. And I'd be much more overwhelmed if we found a lot of smaller companies, or we found companies from other countries, developing world, and so on. But that is a warning sign that something's afoot here, that it is pretty much controlled, dominated currently by very strong Western-based multinationals. Still unsure about the impact of CSR filtering down into developing countries. That whereas we can see the likelihood that this may play out in North America or Europe, there's less evidence on the ground that this is getting traction in the developing countries, particularly in extractive industries. So that seems to be another problem that we need to move on. Shell is big on this, but when you look at Shell's operations, you say, well, where is it? Where's that movement? Maybe there's too much competition, maybe too much profit at stake for this to really stick. Maybe we're at that threshold, but we may not get over that threshold to really full establishment of these, because they may break down. Globalization could be reversed, things might happen. But on balance, I think we're at an interesting point where there's enough substance that it's worth looking at, where there's enough substance to take it seriously, where I think if I had $1 in my pocket that my kids hadn't taken, that I might put that on the table and say, yeah, I think this is going to continue in importance. But I'm still not sure. Still not sure. So I'll leave it at that.